Hello there. This is Andrew Cranus, and I am coming to you from Rome, Italy. My general work here is as a professor of architecture and architectural history, mainly for study abroad students. I work through the University of Arkansas's Rome program, as well as Temple University and Penn State. I'm a teacher of architectural design, and in fact, my own background is that I come to Rome as a winner of the Rome Prize Fellowship. So I spent a year here back in 2008, 2009, falling in love with and steeping myself in the culture of this city while working on independent research projects in my own area of passion, which is urban sustainability and cultural monuments. In the time since I've lived here, this is now coming up on 14 years, I've deepened my knowledge of the city, and one of the things I'm proudest of is to have really figured out a way to understand Judaism in Rome. I'm an American-born Jew myself. I've always been fascinated with Jewish history, and one of the things that will come out of today's class, I hope, is a better understanding for everyone about the intersection of Jewish history and Roman history. We'll be talking today specifically about Rome's Jewish ghetto. The ghetto is a physical place, but it's also a kind of notional and emotional one for the Jews of Rome. One of the things that we will be uncovering today is how the presence of Jews going back to the period before the diaspora, which is to say before the distribution of the many Jews of the world to the regions of the world that have led to the Ashkenazi and the Sephardim, there was a Roman Jewish community, a very well assimilated one that had its ups and downs with the governing authorities, but nonetheless had a very resilient and resistant presence here, which we'll be talking about in some depth. Let's go back to the beginnings. In the 2nd century before the Common Era, Jews were frequently sent to Rome as emissaries for trade and also diplomacy. One notable Maccabee prince, who was called Simon Tassi, was here as early as 139 before the Common Era, and he settled in Rome as a representative of the Judean government. He, in turn, brought his family, and there were many other Jews here who were engaged in trade with the Rome Republic, and this was before the days of the Empire. So back in the 2nd century before the Common Era, Rome was really ramping up to becoming the mega power that dominated all of Europe, that it would later become. That history is evident in some of the archaeological sites around the city, including a cemetery at Ostia Antica, which was the port city that served the Roman Empire, and in the 1st century we see ample evidence of Jews being buried in both above-ground mausoleums and also in catacombs. And those catacombs contain inscribed panels like the ones you see in the photograph there, notably not written in the Hebrew language, but in Greek. And that is because the international traveling, educated, globally oriented Jews of the time were generally educated in the Greek language, which they found to have in common with the Roman settlers of that part of the empire. In the 4th century, we see what is now known to be the earliest European synagogue ever discovered. It's a fascinating structure, and again, we're speaking not about the center of Rome, but about a port city that is just to the southwest of the historic center here. But what makes it significant is that it suggests not just in its own existence from back in the 4th century, but from the obvious presence of a strong and united Jewish community going back earlier than that, that Jews formed a critical part of the mercantile economy of the Roman state at that time. The synagogue itself is a wonderful place. You can see in the photo there a bar mitzvah. This was a ceremony that I had the pleasure of taking part in last summer. A young man from America came with his family, and he had his bar mitzvah actually at the Aron Kodesh of the original synagogue. And as you can see, it's a roofless building, but there are many emblems still present that let us know that it's a Jewish worship space, including the very prominent menorah at the end of the architraves of the building. And this takes us to more commonly known history of the Jews and their interaction with Rome, which is that although there was an assimilated Jewish mercantile community here going back to the 2nd century before the Common Era, the largest influx of Jews actually happens after the Roman Empire itself now under the power of the Emperor Vespasian, conquers the Jewish land, which is to say that there is a sack of Jerusalem in the year 68, and celebrating that particular victory is a very famous monument that sits right in the heart of the ancient Roman Forum. It's called the Arch of Titus. You see it in the image on the left side there. And that monument, which was built to celebrate this long-fought conquest of Judea, is a really pivotal monument to our discussion today. For the first part, it is a classical monument which is very much imitated. If you've ever been to Paris, you have seen a model of this exact object spanning the Champs-Élysées, because when Napoleon built the Arc de Triomphe, he made a perfect 3 times the size replica of this object to place as a celebratory monument of his own empire building enterprise. And one of the most important things about this particular monument is that it has a relief sculpture on it which gives us one of the most enduring symbols of Judaism. It shows Roman soldiers walking off from that conquest, from the defeat of the Maccabee soldiers in Jerusalem, with a famous golden menorah, the 7-armed candelabra, which is one of the many worship articles that were found and then taken as trophies by the soldiers as they destroyed that temple. The temple, of course, I'm speaking of is the one known today by the Western Wall, that last remaining fragment of a building which is really the center of Jewish life in the Holy Land. And it's the use of the symbol of the menorah in this particular artwork, the one that we're looking at there, that becomes maybe the most important emblem of Judaism to the world. So the presence of this particular image in the streets of Rome has led essentially to the use of the menorah as the primary logo, you could say, of Jewish worship spaces the world over. Moving just a couple of years beyond this conquest, what we see is that the conquest of Judea in fact triggers a whole number of things inside of Rome, including the fact that the emperor at the time, Vespasian, whose son is the general that conquers the Jews, begins the construction of the Colosseum, or the Flavian Amphitheater. That massive public building is funded by the taxation and, in a sense, built by some of the labor of the conquered Maccabee soldiers. So this very pivotal moment in Jewish history, when the Jews become part of Rome, also leads in some ways to the most emblematic architecture that is present in Rome itself. For many years, including the whole duration of the remaining Roman Empire, which is to say up until the 5th century, the Romans are living peacefully alongside Jews. Jews are very active in commerce. They also are landowners, and they are an essential part of the maritime economy of the city. And all the way up through the Middle Ages, including the era of the Crusades, Jews are actually a protected group, even when Christianity is on the hunt for other religions, particularly in this instance, the Muslims. There's a specific decree by Pope Calixtus II, which is known as a papal bull of 1120, called Sicut Judaeis, and that one essentially shields Jews from the persecutions that are visited on other cultural groups during the Crusades. So we know that throughout this period, even in a period when Rome itself is in a very economically disadvantaged situation, Jews are relatively thriving. And then comes the Renaissance. And in the 1500s, although there is a great revival of culture in Rome, there's also a crisis within the Roman Catholic Church. And that takes the form of the Protestant faiths. The protests against traditional hierarchical relationships in Christianity that have been promoted by Martin Luther in the 1500s, as well as the defection of King Henry VIII, who, for personal reasons of wanting to be divorced from his wife, decides that the Pope is no longer the central authority connecting him to God. Both join forces, in a sense, to create a movement that rejects papal authority and therefore rejects Rome as the center of the Christian worship space. As a result of that, there is a moment in the 1550s in which Pope Paul IV creates yet another bull, and this one is meant specifically to persecute the Jews. It is called Cum Nibis Absurdum, and what he is saying in this, although it is not related in any way to the Protestants, is that it's absurd for the Catholics of Rome to live amidst people who are not pure of soul like they are, therefore people who are not co-religionists of the Roman Catholics. And it applies directly to Jews, such that at the end of the implementation of this law, they have created the Jewish ghetto. And the ghetto itself is a term that we still use here in a way that allows us to appropriate its original use and speak of it in terms of the cultural pride of the Jewish people. The ghetto, as it's formed back then in 1555, is a small patch of land already primarily occupied by Jewish families. So we see this area, which you can see on the bottom left of the screen, which is a very small 7-acre plot of several city blocks in which all Jews then living in Rome are forced to live. They are also stripped of their rights to own property, they lose citizenship rights, they lose access to education within the governmental system, and they are relegated to trades relating to used merchandise and are not allowed to practice most of their traditional crafts and professions. This punishment really essentially coming from a panic in the Catholic Church as to what people who were non-Roman Catholics might do if allowed to expand and prosper within Christian society. So what you see there on the upper left is how the Jewish quarter evolves, which is as a riverside community. Made sense because the Jews had been living alongside the river, participating in maritime trade there for many centuries, but that comes to be rapidly densified. The buildings along the Tiber get taller, they add stories to them. The Jewish population, although it is confined there, is relatively thriving and swells to as many as 12,000, even though they are living in this tiny little plot. Unfortunately, this particular part of Rome is subject to seasonal flooding, and the Roman authorities do very little to protect it, and therefore this also becomes one of the most disease-ridden cholera, malaria, and other threats to public health, which are intensified by the high population here, and in particular by the very tragic loss of a common source of fresh drinking water, which I'll be talking about in a little while. As we move forward in history, we are moving from the 1500s to the 16 and 1700s, and life goes on. The Jewish community adapts to being isolated within this particular part of town. It is permitted to continue practicing its religion, just as the Jews had been tolerated during the imperial period. The Roman Catholics choose to allow the Jews to essentially have all of their worship spaces within one structure. And what you're looking at on the left there is the Cinque Scole, or the 5 shuls, a single building with several synagogues. You may ask, why would they need more synagogues than one if it was a community that lived within a few blocks? And the simple answer is because the Jewish community had evolved over so many centuries that the cultural and the liturgical traditions of those different groups were so different to each other they couldn't actually worship in the same building. Although Hebrew was the common language, the order of the particular services and the music that was associated with it, and even the authority structures of running the religious service were different among the Catalan and the Sicilian and the Spanish and the various other groups of religious worshippers at the time. Life in the ghetto, in the meantime, was, at least by some romantic measures, a rather charming and almost bucolic one. The streets were paved with dirt, the buildings were close together, they were somewhat dirty, but the community was very cohesive. And in many respects, that forced house arrest within this small zone can be credited with the solidarity that the Jews were able to maintain throughout this period when they were a second-class group living in Rome. However, during this whole time, the Roman Catholic Church didn't see fit to simply leave them alone in this 7-acre plot. In fact, they proceeded to taunt them. The Jews were asked to convert, and in exchange for doing so, they were allowed to become free Roman citizens again. And there were even inscriptions on the churches that ringed the ghetto, like the one that you see here on San Gregorio della Pietà, which is written in Hebrew as well as in Latin. And the inscription on it is from the book of Isaiah. It is certainly taken out of context in this meaning, but you may understand why they chose to put this Isaiah quote on the church that faces into the ghetto. I have spread out my hands all the day unto a rebellious people that walk in a way that is not good, after their own thoughts, a people that provokes me to my face continually. Now, of course, the provoking wasn't really happening on the part of the Jews, it was the other way around, but the Jewish community was seen as obstinate. And in fact, perhaps that's one of the proudest features of Jewish communities around the world. They were not willing to bend to what they were being asked to do by the Roman Catholic Church authorities. And even though in certain periods of the ghetto confinement, the Jews were actually forced to attend Mass on Sundays, many of them were known to plug their ears with wax. Things change in a very important way when Italy unifies. The unification of Italy, which gives us the nation of Italy as we know it today, happens only in 1861. And it's the result of a resistance movement, not on behalf of the Jews per se, but one that benefits them greatly. It's a nationalist movement which is beginning to renounce the authority of the Catholic Church to run the government of Rome. Because up until that point, really practically from the end of the Roman Empire, all the way through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, Rome and the territory surrounding it, known as the Papal States, is a theocracy, which is to say that the Catholic Church is not only in charge of its own affairs as a religious body, but is also the king of the Papal States, the mayor of Rome, the tax collector, and pretty much every pope was also the richest guy in town. The rebellion against this, which is known as the period called the Risorgimento, leads to the installation of a king in place of the Pope. The Pope, which you see there, Pope Pius IX, the one who lost it all, is relegated to his usual role as head of the Roman Catholic Church, but stripped of any authority to meddle in the affairs of state. And in his place, we have somewhat of a figurehead ruler. King Victor Emmanuel is actually an aristocrat from the north of Italy. He's from Torino, and in the very first days of the unification, the capital is Turin. And then it moves for a brief period to Florence, and finally settles in Rome in 1870. And that's the important date marker here. Is just as the nation of Italy is born, just as Rome becomes its capital, so are the Jews liberated from the ghetto. Because one of the very first acts of the government of King Victor Emmanuel, which is a parliamentary government, is to open the ghetto and to reinstate the citizenship of the Jews. So what you see there in the center is a photograph of that moment of unification matched with the liberation of the ghetto and the Jewish community flooding out of the gates beyond the walls of their 300-year confinement to live amongst and work amongst the people of Rome. What follows very shortly after is a period known as the Risanamento. Risanamento means in Italian the restoring to health. And the idea behind it is to take what had been one of the most derelict and unhealthy and unsavory parts of the city and make it a healthier and also arguably more picturesque place. This, you might argue, is partly a matter of kind of airbrushing the Roman image after a very shameful period of persecuting Jews, but what it effectively does is rebuild the community via its architecture. So what you see is a photo on the left there of 6 acres of the original Jewish ghetto, which is virtually leveled. All of those unhealthy buildings dipping into the Tiber River, soaked through with flood waters, are demolished. The families are temporarily relocated, and the city builds its first retaining walls against the Tiber River, which means that the entire neighborhood rises up by as much as 3 stories and meets the edge of the Tiber at a brand new roadway which connects it to the rest of the city. So in the photo on the right, we can actually see a restored to health Jewish ghetto, and in fact several new blocks of brand new buildings both for housing and for institutions. And the significant constructions that go on at this time are of a much larger scale than we're accustomed to seeing in the ancient ghetto. And I'll be taking us through the streets very shortly to talk about how that changes the overall urban layout. But what we can see in that photograph on the left is a sort of rectangular building with a large courtyard, which is the new Jewish Cultural Center that comes online just after the turn of the 20th century. The synagogue itself, which has a characteristic square dome, and we'll be talking about that and visiting the building soon. And then 2 additional very large blocks of housing, some of it quite fancy. And so we'll also talk in some ways about the gentrification of this part of town. But of course the story doesn't end there, because as we know, Italy enters World War II in 1939 on the side of the Axis powers. An alliance is forged between Mussolini, the fascist dictator, and Adolf Hitler, and in exchange for that alliance, Mussolini does something which many believe he didn't want to do but felt he had to for the prosperity in the War of Italy, which is that he enacts what are known as the racial laws. So in 1938, he begins to strip Italian, Jewish, Roman citizens of the rights that they had reacquired in 1870, such that they could no longer go to schools, they were limited again in their professions, and although they weren't imprisoned in the ghetto area, they were very rigorously they were very strictly forced to enter into the census their identity as Jews, and therefore to be limited in what they could do in military service, in government, and so on and so forth. And this culminates during the war of a tragic episode known as the deportations of October 16, 1943. With this census information in hand, the Gestapo come into Rome and attempt to round up all the Jewish families who have already been identified by Mussolini. And what happens, however, is that as many as 2,000 Jews are forced to leave the city and go to the camps. Many of them don't return. In fact, almost none of them return. We're told that as 2,000 were sent away, only 15 came back alive. And this in itself is a horrible tragedy which goes along with many of the miserable events of the Holocaust. But the one bright light in this is that at the time there were as many as 14,000 Jews living in Rome. And so we ask, where were they during the roundups? And what we discover is that during this period, Romans had great sympathy for the Jews, and in fact very much went out of their way to shelter them, to hide their identities, to place them in places where they couldn't be reached by the Gestapo. So most of the Jews who were living in Rome survived in hiding or escaped Italy with the help of non-Jews, thanks to an essentially sympathetic community that surrounded them and that recognized their position in the city going back for almost 2,000 years. More recent history has shown us the bittersweet consequences of that very sad period of the 20th century. What you see on the left there are bronze inlay stones that have, as a sort of marker of that tragic event of 1943, an indication of the names, dates of birth, and dates of assassination of all the people who lived in the various buildings in the ghetto and elsewhere in Rome at that time. This is a project not sponsored by the state, but initiated by an artist called Günter Demnig. And he began this in the 90s. On his own expense, he raised funds so that he could go to all of these places that were affected by the Holocaust, not just in Italy, but around Europe, and essentially create little tribute plaques, which are known as Stolpersteine, or stumbling stones. The stumbling stones are meant to help us to remember the families that were there, force us to reckon with that negative heritage, and at the same time offer some sort of bittersweet tribute to those who were lost in that terrible days of 1943. You see a photograph of him down there, placing some of the most recent ones in Rome, as recently as 2020, and it's only on the family's request that he'll do that. So they live somewhere, they identify someone who was lost during World War II, and he comes, again, at his own expense, and in a kind of public ceremony lays these stones which replace individual cobbles on the streets. Now that's the end of my slide presentation, but we are far from finished talking about the Jewish ghetto. And what I'd like to do next is take you on a slightly more informal journey to the ghetto as I know it now. So I'm going to run a little video clip. So as for all of my walking tours here in Rome, I enjoy getting to the place almost as much as I enjoy taking people around. And here you see me leaving from my home neighborhood of Testaccio to arrive at the ghetto through some of the charming streets of the historic center. The ghetto itself right alongside the river edge, and we pass many of the ancient monuments of the historic center on the way there, and arrive at a bridge called Ponte Giudia, which means that it is the Bridge of the Jews. And we enter into the ghetto precinct via the famous ancient monument known as the Porticus of Octavia. We'll look at this a little bit closer in just a little while, but it's a 1st century pagan monument which forms the border to the modern day Jewish quarter. There is one central road running through the district, lined with Jewish shops and restaurants. And my particular journey today is taking me to one of my favorite Roman bakeries, where I'll stop to pick up a cherry cheesecake, which they do better than anybody else. Under the video, you can actually hear my wife's voice. She's the singer-songwriter who wrote the music that I like to use to score these tracks. There it is, the crostata that I love to buy at this bakery, which is called Boccione. It's a thriving residential neighborhood, but very heavily surveilled. There are police boxes on almost every corner. They weren't too crazy about my filming that day, in fact, but I consider it very worthwhile and an easy trip down the road from my home to have one of my favorite Roman snacks. Next thing I'm going to do is share a map here so that we can actually walk block by block through some of the most important and most enjoyable parts of the Jewish ghetto. What you're looking at here is the rooftops of the Jewish ghetto, a 7-acre site right on the edge of the Tiber River. And as we move out, you can see that its position within the city is not only along the banks of the river, but also just alongside Tiber Island, a rather famous point in the early development of the city where there were 2 bridges connecting instead of one, and because they were the shortest spans, that makes them the oldest and most continually used bridges that we have here. On that island is actually a hospital. It's where both my sons were born, and as I mentioned, the bridges that connect were known collectively as Ponte Judea, because not only did Jews live in the area that we currently call the ghetto, but they also lived on the southern portion of it in the Trastevere neighborhood. And in fact, there is actually the remnants of a 10th century synagogue that I take my students and my clients to see whenever they visit Rome. Moving out just a little further before we move in, you can see that Rome sits well inland of the Mediterranean coast. And so one of the things that's important to remember about Jewish history here is that they were integral to the earliest maritime trade along the Tiber River connecting back to the Mediterranean seaboard, and it is undoubtedly via the sea that Jews first reached Rome. Let's move back in and take a little walk around the Jewish ghetto. And there's no better place to begin our walk than in this small piazza called Piazza Mattei. So I'll bring us down to ground level there. And we can see that it is a plaza accessed from many roads, surrounded by Renaissance palaces. These palaces were here when the ghetto was established, and in fact the ones that we're actually looking at were of wealthy non-Jewish families. But the critical element that I want us to see here is what's right in front of us, this fountain known as the Fontana delle Tartarughe, or the Turtle Fountain, which forms a centerpiece of the narrative about the ghetto, because it's this fountain that was supposed to have been placed within the precinct of the ghetto just as the ghetto doors were being closed, so to speak, but instead sits here at a location immediately outside the gate. If the ghetto was meant to begin by this narrow street that I'm highlighting, this fountain was placed here because of the owner of this palace, which is Palazzo Mattei, owned by a prince known as Mattei, who essentially paid off the local authorities to place a handy drinking fountain in front of his own palace. But as a consequence of that little bit of governmental corruption, the Jewish community was deprived of a fresh water source for over 300 years. And that doesn't mean that they literally never had drinking water, but to explain a little bit about how the ghetto worked, that parcel of land was where the Jews had to live, and they were on a curfew. So that means if they left for whatever they happened to be doing, whether it was work or other errands, they had to be back in by sundown. And Jews were also forced to wear a yellow armband, more or less the same as what legal prostitutes had to wear at the time, to identify them so that the authorities could pick them up, arrest them, and fine them if they were found outside the ghetto after hours. And so that fountain, which may be familiar to you, by the way, if you've ever seen the movie The Talented Mr. Ripley, because Matt Damon's character has an apartment right around the corner from here, is an elegant fountain, but also a kind of bittersweet reminder of the suffering that went on during the ghetto period. If we move down onto the typical streets of the ghetto, what we see is some relatively low-scale architecture, 1- and 2-story buildings, most of them constructed in the Middle Ages or even earlier, and for the most part occupied by Jewish families through the period of tolerance. It's in the 1550s that the papal authorities insist that they all live in this district, when we begin to see that buildings go from 1 story to 5 and 6 stories. And what you may notice about that particular one is that each successive story up becomes shorter, because in trying to save money, they are simply using less material and therefore building shorter rooms. This is undoubtedly a poor community. The ghetto itself, although filled with these simple medieval residential buildings, is also very closely wrapped by Christian buildings, and that is no accident. There are parish houses and church entrances like this one, which are right at the edge of the ghetto and which are in some ways an invitation and a taunt to the Jewish people throughout the time that they're in here. As we move down the street, we see more characteristic views of the narrow passages and tall buildings that make up the old part of the ghetto. And here's where I want to create a distinction, is that the Jewish ghetto itself is formed of these very tiny narrow streets, humble architectures, and as you can see, rather dark passages. But in the reconstruction of the ghetto, which starts at the late 19th century, we see a different kind of urban typology. This road is created, the road known as Via del Portico d'Ottavia. And what you can see looking left and right on this particular road is that there are several buildings left over from the early ghetto period, and you can see them by their humble architecture, their exposed brick and the like, and then the new architecture, which is built to reconstruct or restore to health the Jewish quarter. The bakery I visited is just around the corner here, and I'll take you to it because there's something very interesting in front of it that I'd like you to see. So we're moving down the main commercial drag of Via del Portico d'Ottavia, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute. But first, just outside this bakery called Il Boccione is a patch of pavement. And if it looks like a familiar shape, it is because it is the exact shape of the fountain that we saw on the outside of the ghetto gates. And this is a kind of bittersweet reminder that the Jewish community has created here of the possibility of their having had that fountain, that public amenity, if it weren't for the corruption of Prince Mattei. So this little square here, which is sometimes called Piazza Giudia, is also a very important place of resistance and remembrance. The wall of the ghetto ran right alongside us here. So this very tiny building here, which is actually a Jewish info point right now, is also a fragment of the wall that had separated the ghetto from the rest of the historic center, and it ran all the way down to the edge of the river. But if we move on to the plaza now, what we see is that this was also the location of the original synagogue building. That this building, which was built in the early 1900s, essentially replaced the location of what I referred to before as the Cinque Scole, or the 5 shuls. In that one building were 5 separate sanctuaries for the 5 different communities and liturgies of Judaism, and that building was actually torn down after a fire, only to be built again in much more glorious architectural language in the years immediately after the turn of the 20th century. So we'll move down Via Catalana, named for the Catalan Jewish community, toward the new synagogue. And we're passing along the way residential buildings built in kind of Art Nouveau style, which were a very fashionable place for Jews to return to once they had been granted their rights once again. In the middle of the screen now, you're looking at the front entrance of the Tempio Maggiore. The main temple of the Jewish community isn't just a religious building. This is the headquarters for the entire Jewish community of Rome, which is to say that even if you worship at one of the 17 other synagogues that exist in Rome, you have to establish your membership in this building. Its administration and its head rabbi are located here. And for all of the most important community events, for a community that now is perhaps as many as 14 or 15,000 Jews living in Rome, this is the centerpiece of that operation. The building itself is a real tour de force of modern design inflected with certain classical elements. But it is no Roman Catholic church. Although the building has a dome, you'll notice that it's a square dome, so it doesn't look like any of the Roman Catholic churches in town. And in the front, we see that its decoration, although seemingly at first glance perhaps classical, is not Roman classical, but Babylonian and Assyrian. And the architects who won the competition to design this building were assiduously following the examples of architectures that predated Roman architecture, as a way of emphasizing the presence of the Jews going back to the earliest Roman days, but also in recognizing that the Jewish community didn't want to be represented by just another classically inspired structure. It's a beautiful building inside and out, and I will do my best now to help teach you a little bit about it. So as we move along the side here on Via Catalan, we see that there's a fence surrounding it. It is a heavily guarded building, not least because in 1982 there was an attack on the building by the Palestine Liberation Organization, which actually resulted in the death of a small child. And that's an event that's talked about a great deal in the museum, which is underneath this building. And also, since the events of 9/11, there's an extra measure of security in front of the building so that when you want to enter it, you actually enter from back here. You go past the police station here, and this gate is where the metal detectors are located and where you can go into the underground space, which is a fantastic museum, and be led around by one of the Jewish docents to see the inside of the sanctuary, to learn about the history of the Jews in Rome, and especially about the history of the sad days of the Shoah. And so before we look at the synagogue itself, I want to stop here at this medieval structure, which has in very recent years been converted to an exhibition space in remembrance of the Shoah or the Holocaust. It's a free museum. It actually isn't open all that often these days, but I hope coming out of the pandemic, we'll be able to get in there more often. And it commemorates the events that happened right outside its doors, because it is on this square, which is known as Largo of 16 October 1943, that the Gestapo roundups happened, that all of the deportations I mentioned earlier took place, that the Jews were forced to arrive with suitcases in hand without being told where they were being taken, and that, although many were protected, some were lost in that tragic moment. The monument that marks the entrance here, and which is in some ways the emblem of the ghetto, although it has nothing to do with either Judaism or the history of Jews in Rome in a way, is this temple front built in the 1st century under the Emperor Augustus as a complex of worship spaces dedicated to his sister. It's called the Portico of Octavia, and it is actually only a minor portion of what had been a massive pagan structure going back nearly to the Capitoline Hill. And before we get any farther, I want to emphasize that where we are right now, let me see if I can take us out of this view, is strikingly close to the heart of the city itself. So you see the synagogue just disappearing off the frame there, and just a couple of blocks away is kilometer zero of Rome, the Capitoline Hill, Piazza del Campidoglio, created by Michelangelo to be the town hall of Rome in the 1500s, but even before that, this was the hill that overlooked the ancient Roman Forum. So all of these things that I've been talking about going on in Rome are happening steps away from the centers of governmental and religious authority in the city of Rome for many centuries. And it is a striking thing to think about the fact that the Jewish community has really lived in many ways in the heart of this physical city of Rome, but also at the center of Roman culture for so long. Let's have a look at the Tempio Maggiore, which is a beautiful building, and I think I should be able to get us inside to look at it. So let's see what I can find. The sanctuary is beautifully decorated with classic Roman gold and red coloration in all of these stencil designs on the walls. The design itself is very much of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in keeping with the aesthetics of the Art Nouveau movement. The ark itself, as you see, has a curtain in front of it, and we'll talk in a moment about textiles inside the synagogue. But what it also has is, and let's see if I can find a good image of this, a second sanctuary, which is dedicated to the Catalan worship. So this has remnants from the old five shuls. It's a smaller sanctuary, and it is created to have a second worship space for this other non-originally Roman group of Jewish worshipers. And here we see one of the halls of the museum, and that's something I want to show you in just a moment. This is showing us this extraordinary collection of textiles, textile Torah covers in particular, that were created by Jewish seamstresses, by embroiderers, and people who had learned this trade because they were allowed to practice none other. The Torah covers that are collected here are part of the exceptional display of Jewish culture and Jewish artifacts from all of its periods of history, but particularly representing the trades that were practiced by Jews during the Ghetto period. So what you see inside the museum, and I'm going to thank courtesy of the Jewish Museum itself, I'm able to take a little virtual tour of it here. These cases showing us Torah covers, elaborate embroidery, and ritual elements from Jewish homes, mainly because the Jews during this period were allowed to trade in used merchandise. And so it was leftover fabric from draperies and dresses that they were using to create ritual items for Jewish homes. The museum also has an excellent collection of tombstones, grave markers, similar to the ones I showed you earlier in my presentation, and a very good representation of the history of the Jewish community in didactic displays. In other parts of the museum, we see, for example, the traditions of marriage in the form of the ketubah, or wedding certificate, as well as the ritual items used in the marriage ceremony, and even one example of a Jewish divorce. In the center there, you see a ketubah, or marriage contract, which has been punched through. And that's all it took back in the day to get a divorce in Jewish tradition. Here's the Sabbath table. Just a moment. Typical Roman Jewish Friday night dinner setup, amply decorated with textiles. And lastly, I'd like to show you some of what remains of the five shuls. So you can see the original Aron Kodesh, or Ark, that was taken out of the five shuls. I believe that's the one from the Catalan school. There's the Bima, or the rabbi's seat, from another. And there are even old photographs that showed us what the interiors of those old spaces were like before the demolition of the five shuls building. And I'd like to end with a little view inside of the synagogue, the inside of the sanctuary itself, an extraordinary place where several thousand Jews can gather to worship. And what I want to say about this in parting is that it may be an interesting question for us to discuss in the Q&A, but much of the solidarity of the Jewish community may have to do with the traditional roles that people have played in religious life in Rome. And what I have found as a Jew living in Rome is that, number one, predominantly the practice of Judaism here is in the Orthodox tradition, which is to say that the women are required to sit separate from the men, and you see balconies that are made for that purpose. And also that the bima and the altar, or where the prayer books are placed, is on a table in which the rabbi turns his back to the congregation. Having been raised in a progressive or reformed tradition, these are sort of alien concepts to me, but they may be also emblematic of an attempt to maintain tradition where tradition was being continually challenged throughout the history of the Jewish people here. And I'd just like to end our discussion today by looking at this beautiful mosaic ceiling with its multicolors and the representation of all four of the trees which are represented in the Old Testament, and consider the extraordinary resilience and resistance of the Jewish people in Rome. And with that, I'll end my presentation, but I am very happy to stay with you for some more comments and questions. Thanks for your attention. Hello, everyone. I'm glad you stayed for the whole presentation, and now I'll be with you for a few more minutes to take some questions and to have a bit more discussion about what we've learned today about the Jewish ghetto, 2,000 years of community and resistance. So I'm going to go directly to a few questions that appeared in the chat already. In the meantime, I invite you to formulate any others you might have in the 10 minutes or so that we have left in the hour. Here's a question. Was the persecution of Jews in Italy less than that which occurred elsewhere, specifically in Germany, Russia, etc.? It's a broad question, but I can say that it is probably considerably less than it was in Germany. And in Russia, perhaps it could have been more mixed. But one thing we do know about the Italians' approach to the persecution of Jews in World War II is that it was done in some sense under duress and through pressure from the Nazis, and that neither Mussolini himself nor the Italian population, as we seem to have learned over the years, was particularly invested in what is referred to in Germany as the final solution, as the dissolution of the Jewish community in Europe. So the persecution was severe, and I certainly would not want to minimize that. But there wasn't first of all, there were no internment camps in Italy. So any punishment and deportation that happened was directly at the hands of the Germans. And in that sense, this is a vital difference between the treatment of Jews in Italy and in elsewhere during World War II. Let's see, we've got another one here. How did foundations sufficient for one story serve to support 5 stories in the ghetto? So I'm going to guess that this is an architectural question, even though, forgive me if I'm misunderstanding this. This has to do either with specifically the building that was known as the Cinque Scole, or the 5 Shuls, which was a building that stood for hundreds of years, and a piazza that's known as the Piazza of the Cinque Scole. And that one was actually expressly built once the ghetto was formed to house the 5 different liturgies, or the 5 different regional traditions of Jewish worship. So in the stories that we're talking about here are ones having to do with those different cultural and geographic traditions of Judaism. The simple answer is that the papacy only allowed a single building to be constructed for the purpose of religious worship, and indeed there were actually other shuls or schools that were excluded because the numbers in that community were lower than would allow them to have their own dedicated space. On the offhand, this is a question that has to do more with the reconstruction of the ghetto and what I referred to as the risanamento. I can say that they actually had to completely eliminate the foundations of buildings that were taken down, because those buildings were as much as 50 feet below the level of the streets that exist in that portion of the Jewish quarter today. I hope I've answered that question. Did the Jewish people attempt to leave Rome and Italy altogether before November of 1943? If so, what happened? The answer is, of course, that Jews were very well aware by 1938 that they were being persecuted, that they were going to be bearing the brunt of the persecution by the Nazis once they moved into town in 1943. and undoubtedly many fled. In fact, it is difficult to actually count how many fled precisely because at the moment that the Gestapo came to town and was attempting to round up the Jews, we believe there were between 12 and 14,000 who had at least identified themselves as Jews on the census, but we don't know whether they were present in Rome because they were being harbored or concealed by non-Jewish families around town. So it's a tough one to answer, except to say that it's clear that the Jews saw all of this coming and that many of them, through their allegiance to the non-Jewish community in Rome, made preparations, whether it was actually leaving or somehow remaining in Rome, but undercover. Is there much anti-Semitism in Italy today? I'm going to answer this purely from personal experience and say no. And it isn't only in the sense that I don't consider it to be a major topic of conversation amongst the Italian people that I know, and to the degree that I know Italians who are non-Jews but are curious about Judaism, they are generally quite respectful of Jewish tradition, curious about it, and perhaps it's just the progressive bubble that I live in here, but I don't see in any way a kind of systemic anti-Jewish bias in this culture, certainly not in this city where I live, which is a very global city. I will also add here a little anecdote, which is a well-known story actually here in Rome, is that starting in the 1980s, the Jewish community made a real rapprochement with the Roman Catholic Church after many years of having been, of course, punished, but also being somewhat ignored. Pope John Paul II came to visit the Synagogue of Rome, I think it was in 1985 or maybe it was 87, and made a very moving speech, which is frequently quoted here, especially if you visit the Jewish Museum, when speaking to the Rabbi Toaf, who was at that time the head rabbi of the Jewish community, referring to him and to his flock as our elder brother, which was certainly considered a moving tribute to the respect that the Pope had, and therefore that afterward the Church seemed to have for the Jewish community. Let's see what else we have. A whole bunch have been coming in. Let me see if I can get to a few more. Okay. After 300 years, why did a pope decide to reverse the Roman policy of Jewish discrimination? Good. Okay, so I'm glad this question has come up because I want to be clear that the Pope did not decide to do so. The papal bull of 1555, which was issued by Paul IV, was a law within the Roman Catholic Church which applied to the state of Italy because the Pope was head of state. And what's changed by 1870, 300 years later, is the Pope is no longer head of state, and therefore the decrees that had been issued by the Pope with respect to any Italian citizen no longer had any legal validity. So in fact, we do know that Pope Pius IX had written an encyclical just before he was dismissed as the head of state here, in which he was renouncing the persecution of Jews. But believe it or not, he actually died before it was published, and so in many senses his legacy is one of being the last persecutor. Okay, let's see what else. Who paid for the rebuilding of the Jewish ghetto? When persecuted, why didn't the Jews just leave? Okay, two questions in one, really. Let's start with the first one. The payment for the rebuilding of the Jewish ghetto on the level of actually changing the terrain, which is to say protecting the Jewish ghetto from floods by demolishing the buildings that had been dipping into the Tiber for hundreds of years, raising the ground, and creating a retaining wall, was part of a large national project that was initiated in 1870 by King Victor Emmanuel II. It actually involved significant funds that came from Italian taxation, so not exclusively Roman funds, and it was part of a much larger program of returning the city to health, especially with respect to its close connection to the river and all the perils that implied. The buildings themselves, the commercial buildings and the residential buildings, were privately developed, but the Jewish community, along with significant infusion of money, as I understand it, from the Italian state, was able to realize the synagogue itself as well as the current Jewish cultural center. What else have we got? I saw one early in the scroll here. Okay. Is it known what % of Rome's population is Jewish, or is it even counted anymore? It is counted. The count now is actually rather unchanged since World War II by the official count of the Jewish community of Rome, which is centered on the Tempio Maggiore, the big building that I showed you in the presentation. However, that number at around 12 to 14,000 does not count many people who don't consider the Tempio Maggiore to be their Jewish home, and I'm one of them. There's among probably several others, there is a progressive Jewish community in Rome called Beth Hillel, which does not have a building, although it perhaps may one day. But about 8 years ago, a number of Jews, many of them defecting from the official Jewish community of Rome, some expats like myself, many of them in mixed marriages, and having various other reasons, formed this more progressive, non-Orthodox practicing Jewish community, which, because it's not enrolled in the Comunità Ebraica, basically doesn't get counted in those numbers. So I would say, let's just say conservatively, that there are 15 or 16,000 Jews living in Rome. And of course, if you added visitors, many, many more than that. Let's see what we've got here, and I should be mindful of the time. We've got a few more minutes. Were Jews charged a special tax to be permitted to live within the ghetto? Did Jews face expulsion as the result of being scapegoated? Okay. The first one, as to a tax, no, not that I'm aware. They were taxed in the way that Roman citizens were taxed, and they were forced to live in the ghetto, but it wasn't a kind of per se charge for living in the ghetto. So I would say no to that one. And did Jews face expulsion as a result of being scapegoated? No, that was actually never a government policy. The Jews were allowed to leave, and they were otherwise, in this case, forced to live in the Roman ghetto if they chose to stay on here. Many of them economically had no other choices. And during the original ghetto period, this is going back into the 1500s, we're already now in the wake of the expulsion of all Jews from Spain under Queen Isabel. So there's actually an enormous number of Jews who are migrating to other places and end up in Italy as a result of having been evicted by the purges happening under the Inquisition in the 1500s in Spain. Let's see. If this is not yet a question. I'm seeing if a question comes out of it. Okay. This is a thought question, which I'll give my own thoughts about, but maybe it could be one of the ones that we leave ourselves with. Normally, if a city would wish to isolate a group of people, it would move them to another location outside the city center. It seems a bit dangerous to have the ghetto so close to the physical center of power in Rome. Thoughts? I do have a couple, and I don't think that they resolve the question in any way, but I think it is actually profoundly significant that the Jewish ghetto was created at a location that's literally within a few hundred meters of the Capitoline Hill, which represents in some ways the ultimate location of power going back to Roman antiquity. There is, I think, implicit in that a recognition that the Jews are a part of this community, but that in isolating them, they are meant to be a community apart within the fabric of Rome, which sounds odd, I know. But there was a tradition of religious tolerance in the ancient Roman period, going back again to before the ghetto period, in which the Jews, one has to imagine, were tolerated for practicing the religion as they did. But at the same time, they were perhaps not as privileged citizens. I'm sure they had fewer opportunities than their pagan polytheistic neighbors. They certainly were not making a big they didn't have a big presence in government that we're aware of. There's very little literary record of any individual Jews apart from Simon Tassi, whom I mentioned at the top of the talk. So my suspicion about it is that there is maybe two reasons. One, the location where they kept the Jews was actually not a particularly desirable one on many levels, mainly because of its exposure to the flooding of the Tiber, and therefore it became an unhealthy place to live. But at the same time, displacing the Jews to somewhere else would have created a little bit of cognitive dissonance about whom the Jews were, and would have been tantamount to a kind of expulsion, which I don't think was ever the intention of that papal bull. And we're just a minute from the end of the hour, so I'm going to say, rather than take any other questions, I will just thank you very much for your attention. It's been a pleasure to join you, and I certainly look forward to joining One Day University again to talk about other Roman topics. Thank you very much for your attention, and have a good day or evening wherever you are.